Here's some food for thought.
Can it be juice?
Thank you, my lovely artificial audience. It's the show about extracting nutrients from plant matter.
It's the big one. It's the...
Can it be juice?
On Pikmin 2 on the GameCube, Wii, and Nintendo Switch, we have returned to the Dream Den after getting the Kiwi, and found ourselves on the second floor, dealing with a Gatling groink in a wooden space with blocks, getting a pencil and a sharpener, starting a theme that will carry further in. Jumping into the third floor, we discover more electric hazards and danger at every turn. Some for you, and some for your enemies. We get a joystick, then head in strategically into the fourth floor to avoid much more needless danger. Finding cannon beetle larvae everywhere.
Oh,
and with
son of
some hilarious strategic aiming, you can clear the road to get a coin. Then jump in the hole to find yourself on a level 5 with jets of fire, blowhogs, and sleeping bulborbs. You deal with those, then a fiery bowblacks, to finally reveal our fruit, a relative of the loquat and the mother of all American symbols. It's the final recurring fruit of Pikmin 2, also the most iconic one of the series. But before we can escape, we will need to continue down the floors. Next is the 6th floor, with irritants and jelly floats, getting a crystal ball. Then the 7th floor has blowhogs and dirigibugs, where you get jewelry. 8th floor, all the dweevils again, and that's where you get a Russian doll and a jack-o'-lantern. 9th floor is a rest area. 10th floor is more water, water dumples, a Gatling groink, Wollywog, and fire and water to get Hanafuda cards! 11th floor, the return of bread bugs and other annoying creatures to get a mustard lid and a shogi tile. 12th floor, there's poison, frogs, orange bulborbs, and hey! Baking powder in a ring. 13th floor, bulborbs. Would you look at that? A root beer bottle cap. And then finally, the last floor. We're dealing with the Titan Dweevil. And Dweevils take on the characteristics of whatever is on their head. And look who is on there. It's freaking Louie. And he's on a beast that is armed with every element a Dweevil can create. After all, Louie is attracted to shiny objects, and would have a negative impact on this creature's mind. I wonder why. You have to remove all its weapons first. Its watery one is most recommended. Then either it's fire or poison next. So your yellows have the electric one all to themselves. Then you can pound the Titan Dweevil's hide into oblivion. Freeing Louie, he is labeled the King of Bugs, because he has a sort of neurological connection to them. What we find out when getting Louie back home is that he ate the golden pick carrots! You know, the reason why Olimer's company was put into bankruptcy? And we had learned through our messages throughout our journey from Louie's grandmother is that because of his hatred of being outside, because of the bugs biting him, she made him eat the bugs and plants, being the catalyst to create the most self-centered glutton in Nintendo history. Rotten to the core. It's your fault, woman! I don't know why Olimar doesn't reprimand the man. Regardless of Olimar's ignorance and this family's massive character flaws, all the treasures of Pikmin 2 were acquired and brought to Hakatate. And aside from the less fruity treasures, we got the Cupid's Grenade, the Sunseed Berry and its larger equivalent, the Citrus Lump, Disguise Delicacy, and finally, the Insect Condo, or the Apple! If there was a fruit that has been transformed or associated with a character spanning a wealth of franchises, it's the apple. The token fruit of success, of places, the first sin, a slice of heaven, and one of the kings of juicing. There's not a single doubt they can be juiced. But what is the best apple for it? first, we will need to learn about the types of apples out there. There was a legendary man who spread the crop across America, who in one interpretation sang, "The Lord is good to me, and so I thank the Lord for giving me the things I need, the sun and the rain and the apple seed. Oh, the Lord is good to me." That was for you, Pops. That man that song is associated with would be responsible for the existence of at least 6,500 types of apples. The fruit has gotten so big in culture. There's a name for their study, pomology. But there's 3 specific categories: the baking, the tasting, and the snacking. These apples have their subcategories being the sweet and tart varieties. And even further still, there are categories within these, being tender and firm. A firm apple can retain its shape when cooked, whereas a tender apple doesn't stay together when cooked. Coincidentally, it is the firmest of apples with a balance of sweetness and tartness that make the best juice. While the apple in the second game of Pikmin is of a generic look, the apple you get in Pikmin 3's Burrowing Snakeret is more distinct. When it comes to the type it looks the most like, it resembles more of a Jonagold apple, which is a mix of Jonathan and a Golden Delicious. There's a connection. Its coloring is yellow of Golden Delicious, with a large wash of red. Though depending on the climate, Jonagold apples can be yellow, green, yellow, or a blend of orange and red as well. This is a crisp apple to bite into, with a delicious gleaming white flesh that resists browning. Fun fact, the same enzyme that makes an apple brown has been discovered to give us a tan. It is, of course, melanin. Yeah, the stuff that makes our skin. Anyway, the apple's flavor is quite sweet, but with a lot of balancing acidity. It is absolutely a very pleasant fruit. This American apple, developed in the 1940s, had a second parent, Jonathan, which is an old American variety discovered in the 1820s. When it comes to juicing, however, Jonagold is not the most ideal kind to use. The standard variety, the Red Delicious.
The Red Delicious apple is trash.
Would not be the best kind to juice either, as the yellow it once had is what gave it flavor, and has an inconsistent hold, leaning on the more tender kind of fruit. Whereas Japan's gift to pomologists around the world, the Fuji, would be fantastic for juicing, but it wouldn't fit in a typical juicer.
Fuji apples.
Yeah.
They're great.
To explore the origins of the apple, though, we have to, for the first time, do a double dose of What Did Lockstin Forget? Starting the segment with one of my all-time favorite berries, the Leppa berry. That's hard, grows slowly, and tastes better the smaller it is every flavor except dry, has the natural gift typing of fighting, and restores 10 PP to 1 move. That last feature makes it one of my favorites. Easiest dang ether to acquire. Oh yeah, and it's based off what considered to be the proto-apple, the crab apple. Lockstin said crab apples have a few varieties, but the term crab apple is also sometimes used to mean wild or feral apples, much they're out and about rather than farmed, neglecting to mention that the term apple was once used for any generic fruit. Heck, fruit is also a generic term for any edible bulbous growth on a plant, like cashews that grow from an apple are also fruits themselves. Heh, fruit on fruit action. The French, or Calossians, call one vegetable
pomme de terre, which is apple of the earth.
Potatoes. In fact, we get pomology from their palm. Anyway, back to the Lockstin.
And also, according to some, the natural sugars found in apples can give you a boost of energy, similar to coffee. Crab apples especially, because they are so hard and sour that
You missed some flavors.
they just punch you in the mouth.
Was that actually his reasoning for a Leppa berry's natural gift typing by mistake?
That'll really wake you up for sure. More energy for more moves.
First note, the berry's info says it is tastier the smaller that it is.
Wrong.
Why would anything like a more sour flavored fruit? However, they got its hard exterior right, and gratefully that explains one flavor, as they are more acidic than their descendants. Though some crab apples are sweeter than others. 2 more flavors to go. Since these weirdos think a Leppa berry tastes better when it is smaller, would not lose its bitter aftertaste, since they don't let it fully ripen. That leaves one last flavor, spicy, the big apple, getting its name from there are many apples on the tree, but only one big apple in show business. New York gives us the last piece of the puzzle. They made an apple called the Snapdragon, that when it is unripe would be a little sweet, spicy, and sour with a bitter aftertaste. And there you go. I'm sure we can come up with a more scientific explanation for a fighting type as a natural gift than what Lockstin mistakenly came up with. I got just the thing. Quercetin, an antioxidant in apples, can help reduce inflammation and muscle damage from exercise. Also in an apple's skin, there's ursolic acid, a major waxy component in apple peels, as a potential therapy for illness and age-related muscle wasting. They say that the compound acts in part by counteracting characteristic changes in gene activity during muscle atrophy. Well, that was easy. Being a more hardy fruit, crab apples are resistant to diseases, lasting longer than most of its descendants that once totaled to 10,000 or more varieties. Some were lost to either blight, a loss of keeping, the war on booze, and selective marketing. These days, you can find apples in literally every color of the rainbow, starting their story in Kazakhstan, like a Borat, crazy enough. Though botanically, crab apples are just small, standard apples, boasting a healthy dose of vitamin C, have soluble fiber, and rich in polyphenols. And Alton Brown,
Like the hat?
won't let us forget they have plenty of pectin.
A kind of fruit glue that holds cell walls together. It's like gelatin, only a carb, not a protein.
Pectin is actually a prebiotic, like what dragon fruits have, that benefits gut health, and there's the quercetin again, that also regulates the immune system, with only 0 to 50% GI tract absorption. And now we will tackle the second half, which will tackle 2 episodes. Funnily enough, we asked the question in favor of a certain candy apple. Is candy considered food? Lockstin posed the idea that food is food when it is edible, or anything fit for consumption. Luckily, Applin's apple isn't the Pokemon, so we can munch away. Though that raises another question. How do typical food examples exist when they didn't before? Is the unnamed dragon apple a kind of oversized Leppa berry? Because remember, all crab apples are just undergrown regular apples botanically. But where would these other kinds of apples come from? Well, now we know that all apples stem from Kazakhstan. So let's have a look at the type of apples in Pokemon. Originally, the apples you could get were version exclusive. The sweet apple, once exclusive to Shield, would reflect apples like Fuji, Gala, and Honeycrisp. The tart apple, that was exclusive to Sword, reflects apples like Golden Delicious, Pink Lady, and the Granny Smith. Apples tend to vary in their pH level, generally falling between 3.3 and 4. Sweeter apples tend to fall on the more acidic part of the gauge, which makes it all the more perfect that the one with the sweet apple gets the move Apple Acid, as the higher acidic apple gets the move that would be the product of malic acid, citric acid, and ascorbic acid. Remember those from the lime? Malic acid was the sole organic acid that determines an apple's overall acidity. The genetics of an apple use the gene called Ma. Ma for high acid, Ma for balance, and Ma for low acid. However, the Ma gene tends to be the more dominant, making a sweet apple more common overall. Then in Kitakami, another apple was thrown into the mix, the candy apple or syrupy apple. which doesn't require a specific apple for its coating. People can use a tart apple Granny Smith from Australia in 1868, or the delightful Fuji from Fujisaki, Japan in the late 1930s, and marketed in 1962. The Jazz Apple, which is a cross between a Royal Gala and a Braeburn, developed in 1985. The year was freaking born from New Zealand, and the Gala, which also came from New Zealand in the 1930s. That would mean, based on where kid economy takes place, Japan, the beloved Fuji would be the syrupy apple of choice. I'm freaking shocked the Lockstin didn't delve into any of this. All he did was say Applin was what he referred to as a worm living in an apple, that for some reason debuted in Great Britain. We'll get there. Fun fact, in Galar, giving a person an Applin is an effective way to confess one's feelings of love and ask them out. And this Pokemon evolves into Flapple, Appletun, or Dipplin. One could argue that each form of Applin represents a kind of apple. Flapple for snacking, Appletun for baking, and Dipplin for tasting. Oh, and this came from Lockstin's comment section. Appletun, while containing the word tun, meaning an enclosure or house, is also an allusion to the term Appletun, which means orchard in Old English. What I find most amusing that in the world of Pokemon, for the housing of Applin, there's no future in tender apples. Since tender apples fall apart so easily, they wouldn't withstand any application in Applin's overall gimmick. If Applin runs out of apples to eat, or if it is separated from its apple, its body will lose moisture, and it will become dehydrated and weak. As it grows by eating the flesh of the apple, Applin uses its own body fluid to strengthen the apple's skin and prevent it from rotting. Its body fluid counteracts the innate gene that causes the apple to degenerate. All apples need to be firm for every form, as only a firm apple will be able to withstand theoretical flight. Only a firm apple would withstand baking, and only firm apples would be best to be encased in red cinnamon syrup. Each branch of the Applin line leads to completely different tangents, all of which could lead to some interesting facts. So, let's start with Flapple, being an extension of the overall history of the fruit, and also delving into apple engineering and art. Also, it learns the move Grab Apple, and its animation shows an apple falling from the tree. This is clearly a hint towards Sir Isaac Newton and the formulation of the law of gravity. In German, the move is simply called gravitation. Also, Flapple is the evolution that can fly and thus defy gravity. Thanks, Life Lessons 7401. Of course, the apple started as the unimpressive crab apple. Though it was brought to the Americas in the 1600s, with the first orchard in the States dating back to 1625 by William Lockstin, followed by the works of truly legendary yet celibate man who left his mark on both history and American culture. Johnny Appleseed, born John Chapman, started his life in Leominster, Massachusetts back in 1774. His dream was to produce so many apples that no one would ever grow hungry. While one legend paints a picture of Johnny as a dreamy wanderer, planting apple seeds throughout the countryside, simple research revealed him to be a careful, organized businessman. Over a period of nearly 50 years, bought and sold tracts of land and developed thousands of productive apple trees. For half a century, he created nurseries from Massachusetts to even Canada. He spread his seeds, was an advocate for life, was considered to be eccentric, taught how to plant, sold his trees for a small fee, contributed to the creation of Red Delicious and Golden Delicious apples, and lived to the ripe old age of 70. known for his faith and lived for others. But before the legend of John Chapman, there's more to the core of the apple story after Kazakhstan. You see, apples are not self-fruitful, meaning that in order to have a single apple, you have to pollinate it from a kind of tree to another that leads to a wealth of new varieties. And in theory, the next would have to be the best traits from their parents. Because it took carrying the seeds of apples from Kazakhstan to Europe in 1500 BC to grow more cultivars. Then ancient Greeks discovered grafting, a practice Johnny Appleseed detested, by the way, in 800 BC. Then, ancient Romans planted orchards in Britain in 200 BC, which explains how Applin originated, quote-unquote, in Galar. Japan got their first apples, crab apples, from China around 918 AD, but didn't get a taste of our varieties from America until 1871, becoming something to wish good fortune and prosperity, leading to the blossoming art of fruit carving. Its history truthfully intertwines as much with diverse narratives from Thailand, China, and Japan. Sure, it's gotten its popularity in the last decade or so, but the origins clash, like the knives needed for the art. As some accounts suggest, fruit carving started during China's Tang Dynasty, a good era with an apropos name for redefining the transformation of flavor. Whereas Thailand's traditional lore attributes its popularity to the Loy Krathong, with Loy meaning to float and Krathong being a buoyant basket festival in the Sukhothai region. You can use this holiday to float away your anger and grudges. There's a 14th century tale that revolves around Nang Napa March, who was the servant of Thai King Phra Huang, who pioneered fruit carving during the Festival of Lights, the Krathong. Japan got the tradition of artistically slicing fruit through decorative garnishing. Oh, that's right! Thai fruit carving uses a different single knife for their craft, whether it is the round handle or plain handle knife versus mukimono, which uses a sharp, thin knife. As for whether hollowed-out apples would maintain flight, they're relatively resilient fruits, as it requires overcoming the fruit's structural integrity. It takes a considerable amount of hand strength if you try to crush it, though considering Flapple's third weakest stat happens to be physical defense, and its speed being the worst stat, it's not the slowest of the apple dragons. That goes to the originally Shield exclusive, and my first favorite evolution of the worm, Appletun. Man, that was a good apple.
Now Appletun, the sluggish grass dragon type, connects directly to the purpose of the baking apple, making desserts both sweet and savory. But before we delve into that rabbit hole, I have to give you one surprising connection. Applin has a Paldean Pokemon that is a perfect complement to it. It's Fidough! The Dough Dog's got breath that contains yeast that is very likely the species of Saccharomyces cerevisiae, also known as baker's yeast or brewer's yeast, being the microorganism most commonly responsible for fermentation. It's a relative of shroomish or toadstool. Yeast was most likely first discovered in Egypt. Then in the 19th century, bread bakers obtained their yeast from brewers of booze, leading to sweet fermented breads such as the imperial Kaiser Semmel roll. Whereas the Chaldeans, or the Spaniards, would call yeast levadura, while the curiously levadura in polvo is baking powder. Scientists tend to describe the discovery of the role of yeast in fermentation in relation to the visual discovery of the morphology of the yeast organisms by J.H. van den Broek in 1859. Though logically, if Fidough was discovered before the first bread, they would have made pain de sal, or bread of salt, which was hard and crusty and an answer to the French baguette. Fun fact, Spain's first bakery opened in 1631, getting its wheat flour from China. However, Britain would have used Fidough later by the 1780s and 1790s. It was not until the 1860s that Louis Pasteur identified yeast as a living organism. That's a long time to not know it was alive. As for where the yeast was isolated from, it originally was from the skin of another fruit, but that's another show. Ha! Getting back to apples, their original application was actually making the hard stuff, and that required their own yeast. Enter the Saccharomyces found on apple skin, as they would need sugars to grow and reproduce. Fruit, overall, provide everything for these microbes to flourish. Then along comes Decara and Brettanomyces to finish the job. As for the history of cider, it's a whole other ball of wax. For after apples left the home of Aborat, it took on a whole new ball game. The Olma, the original Kazakh word for the fruit, spread to Rome, then Germany, then France, where the term palm was adopted by even the English. Britain, however, is where the apples, like dessert apples and cider apples, took root. The word cider is derived from the Hebrew shekar, meaning strong drink, to the theoretical progression from sizer or sizer from Latin, to the French cicera, to the Italian sidro, then the French again cider, which translated into cider, like a game of telephone. The hard stuff was first to New England before the Germans brought over their fermented hop juice. That one survived prohibition, but the fermented apples did not. Some apple trees had to face the wrath of angry Puritans. However, one great thing came from this point in history: sweet cider. Yeah, the foggy stuff! Then, because of demand, the unfiltered apple beverage eventually led to the apple juice we all know and love. This is how hard and soft drinks got their distinction. Hard drinks are defined as harsh or sharp to the taste from the colonial days. From bad waters to bad brews, created an industry that dwarfs the liquid it was compensating for. The lack of the original enemy of dehydration in a clean state, H2O, or water, was defeated in sales. Whereas the term soft drink was originated to distinguish the drinks from spirits and ales,
with ginger ale and ginger beer being the exception.
plus my favorite, a good sarsaparilla. But the first marketed soft drink was, of course, a lemonade in 1676. However, in the business side of apples, only one company has held its place in culture long enough to have two treasures in Pikmin 2. The Thirst Activator and the Fruit Guard. And that's Treetop! It was the premier grower-owned apple processing cooperative of the United States. Founded by Bill Charbonneau, who after moving from Southern California with his family to Selah, Washington, purchased an apple processing plant. Then in the 1950s, he developed the very brand of apple juice featured in Pikmin 2, the treasure Fruit Guard. Though to differentiate his juice from others, Bill sought the expertise of global experts in fruit processing. One of those experts was Carl Weisbrod, who has been credited with developing the process of making a shelf-stable apple juice. Charbonneau also bought the first U.S. patent rights to a clear apple juice process developed in Switzerland, But the name of the company had to come from within. You see, there was a contest that was held amongst his employees, leading to the name Treetop, due to the perception that the highest quality of fruit grew at the tops of trees. Then a few orchardists bought Bill's company in 1960, buying the rights to the first clear apple processes developed as well as its facilities. Along with its subsidiary, Sabroso Company, they make a wide array of fruit-based products, not limited to the Treetop brand apple juice, but also their applesauce, which was showcased in Pikmin 2 as the treasure oddly named Thirst Activator, but was better titled in the original Japanese as the Nature Advertisement. And of course, Treetop has their fresh sliced apples. One last great aspect to the Treetop brand is that their cooperative growers were motivated to come together as a means of transforming excess and unattractive fruit into delicious products for families to enjoy. Today, they still save ugly and excess fruit more than 800 million pounds each year after expanding their expertise. From the numerous varieties of produce-based products, they increased their range into cereals, baby food and snacks, to dairy treats, pet food, and more.
Going from an ale to cider, both kinds, to juice and many products, it's time to explore the second track of Saccharomyces, baking! The dessert we attribute as being the ultimate inspiration for Appletun, good old apple pie, dates back to a written recipe published before the discovery that yeast is a fungi, mushrooms are, in 1381, referred to as a tortoise in Apples. While we know the apple pie for having a buttery, flaky crust, the originals were far from edible, being made out of flour and water, being several inches thick, and only existing to encase the filling in coffins, making caskets made of pastry. Yeah, having a body that heavy would make a dragon type like Appletun as slow as molasses, and its skin contains flour. Actually, making flour is really easy. Just take a grain, then put in its berries. Not those berries! There you go. Grind it in a mill, and voila! You have flour. Whereas Applin's natural yeast, again, fungi, gains power through fermentation via something called adenosine triphosphate. That will be my only Bill reference. Then feast on either sugars or carbohydrates, which is interesting, because when any fungi make fermentation in bread through an aerobic pathway, it does the exact opposite of a plant.
Photosynthesis!
Creating CO2, or carbon dioxide, like we do, which makes dough nice and soft or fluffy from basically burping. Come here. In the bread. Bakers call this leavening or raising. It's a food agent, if you will. While there's active dry, instant, or rapid rise types of yeast that are marketed, an Applin would have fresh yeast. In this worm's body, while its sugars feed its yeast, and when it adds salt to its diet, it would counter most of the nasty bacteria that affect its processes. Curiously, an Appletun produces a nectar, which would be made by organs called nectaries or nectarines. Hilarious. Nectar is made as a byproduct from consuming sugars. Are we its bees, feeding off its body strips to help it cycle? They eat, then manufacture consumable scales while it loafs around. Appletun is its own mill, taking its own yeast, salt, sugar, which is eaten granules of wheat berries to produce delicious dough scales. It's quite fascinating to think the same mon is capable to attack with its own internal acids, albeit less acidic than what Flapple could create, as its acid is somehow corrosive.
That don't make no sense.
So you could make the argument that inside an Appletun's body, seeds could at some point become malt after consuming enough water in its casket-like stomach to awaken a magical enzyme already existing in the grain when it starts sprouting. When those seeds are tricked to have been convinced they've had enough rain, they start germinating and produce amylase. Enzymes are proteins that trigger a whole genetic process building from its own internal amino acids. Those seeds, at that stage, contain a wealth of starches that break down into sugars. They're reserves of food for the plant later, until it makes its own through
Photosynthesis.
it makes maltose. Specifically at this point in its growth, Appletun has plumules like this, which bear cotyledon that
Reach for the sky.
and never get to its full plant stage, being acrospires. Unfortunately, the process of baking tends to stop Protose's ultimate potential. Cold! But it's important for us to know that the yeast takes over, like with Paris. Yes, even yeast eats amylase. But what if you wanted another dessert mon that fills the role of a special attacker? What if candy could join the fight? But before we can look into the candy apple, we'll need to have a little filler first. Time to backtrack to the apple pie. I had plumb forgot to mention the second part of the dessert, the origins of its filling. While the pie as we know it was once a casket filled with, frankly, crap back in 1831, being akin to more of a mincemeat pie. You heard that right, the first pies were meat pies. Then it went from inedible Tupperware to what we call a Dutch delight in a recipe found from 1514. It's Dutch in quotes, because while it accurately is used for the people of the Netherlands, it has also been incorrectly used for the Germans. So to avoid that confusion, we can call this dish the apple tot, the one with the lattice, not the apple crumeltot, which is also known as crumb apple pie. Under the former's latticed exterior is a filling consisted of thickly chopped apples and raisins flavored with fragrant, warm spices such as cinnamon, ginger, and nutmeg. However, their crust, made with flour, sugar, butter, salt, egg, and water, is typically much thicker and crisper compared to other world-famous pies, as the French equivalent tarte tatin tends to have a puff pastry or cookie-like crusts and baked upside down and served without a top crust. The Swedish apple pie is more of a crumble. Traditionally, the apple tot has been made with tartly sweet apple varieties, but has been recommended to have a combination of various kinds of apples to achieve more complex and exotic flavors. Then you could add whipped cream or ice cream to add even more. But when the immigrants from Europe brought the recipes over for these desserts into the New World, they had to wait until they could grow proper pie apples before the first recipe was published in 1697. In Alan Metcalf's America in So Many Words, Words That Have Shaped America. That was when it became one of the quintessential dishes of the once United States of America. And now, we can finally fast forward back to 1908, when candy apples were made. Of course, we all know that they came from New Jersey.
Candy apples were invented in New Jersey?
Don't insult people's states, Lockstin! It's the neighbor of Unova, and that it was invented for the Christmas season, using cinnamon candies for decoration initially. But how was it made? Let's get some things out of the way first. Food coloring for starters. Like most food inventions or discoveries, its origins date back to the time of the Egyptians, where the earliest counts of colorants added to foods was found, as they were natural originally. as our old friends the carotenoids and anthocyanins paired with chlorophyllin and betanin, comprising 4 main categories of plant pigments grown to color food products. Other colorants or specialized derivatives of these core groups include annatto, a reddish-orange dye made from the seed of the achote, caramel coloring made from caramelized sugar, carmine or carminic acid, a red dye derived from the cochineal insect, the Dactylopius coccus. Explains a lot. It is also known as natural red 4, so if you don't want to eat insects, I suggest avoiding that. Elderberry juice, lycopene, which happens to be a carotenoid, paprika, made from ground up peppers. There's no way I'm not going to do an episode for them. Turmeric, or curcumin, then spirulina. But what about synthetic colorants? Those emerged back in 1856 with a purple. Movine, the first synthetic color, was developed by Sir William Henry Perkin. And by the turn of the century, unmonitored color additives had spread through Europe and the United States in all sorts of popular foods, including ketchup, mustard, jellies, and fermented juice. These colorants were dubbed coal tar colors, as the starting materials were obtained from bituminous coal. Today, synthetic dyes are preferable, as they cost less and give better results. The dye we are going to concern ourselves with is an azo dye made specifically to replace amaranth, a dye made from a grain, distinguished by its red color and edible protein-rich seeds. For in 1976, our old foes, the Food and Drug Administration, took one of the original dyes made from coal tar and accused it of being a carcinogen. So after that, they had to look to science to find a less problematic alternative. Enter Allura Red AC, or FD&C Red 40, occurring as a red-brown powder or granule. It's become the most utilized red dye today. It's used for coloring food, drugs and cosmetics, including beverages, frozen treats, powder mixes, gelatin products, candies, icing, jellies, spices, dressing, sauces, baked goods, and dairy products. However, in the world of desserts, when you, for example, want to color chocolate, you use oil-based coloring. For candy apples, we'll instead need gel-based coloring. Though, if you were to make it shiny, we would use airbrush coloring. The syrup for candy apples is actually really simple. For 12 apples, 6 cups of sugar, 4 cups of water, and a cup of light corn syrup. Then add 1.5 teaspoons of butter vanilla and make sure the syrup flows freely. To avoid translucence, you will need a few drops of Wilton's White liquid color. Hobby Lobby has a great food coloring of Super Red, which makes the perfect crimson color for your apples. The mixture needs to be 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Before you dip though, make sure you clean your fruit of its wax and its possible sugar munchers, wiping the top to prevent unwanted bubbles. Then put in your sticks and start rolling your apples into the finished mixture. Then let it dry, popping any bubbles that form with a toothpick. But I bet I can hear you saying out there, I thought they used cinnamon candies in the original recipe. Ah, easy. All you need is a few drops of cinnamon oil in your mixture before you dip. Let the apple tart. A tart apple is a good complement to its opposing flavors, like sweet and spice, of this candy's crimson coating. Now, where did the cinnamon candies come from? Well, let's start with the cinnamon.
Oh, yes. Cinnamon. A tasty spice made from the inner bark of the laurel tree, commonly found in southwestern India.
One source says it came from Egypt, being used as medicine for digestive issues and a treatment for ulcers. Then add it being an ingredient for embalming mummies, making it a lingering scent by Egyptologists. Then the Greeks and Israelites had a taste of what they originally called cinnamon, leading to myth with the Cinemologus Pokemon Company adapt this pronto. But of course, ultimately, it was discovered to have originated from India, like Yungoos and Kufant. This is where the term candy came from kanda, meaning a piece of sugar. Soon the Europeans got access to the cinnamon, bringing it to the Americas because it was not feasible to grow it in their countries. Soon it was able to be consumed by all, but only 4 countries were able to grow it: Indonesia, Vietnam, China, and then Sri Lanka. Centuries passed, and by the 19th century, aka the 1800s, candies were made with what flavors were in at the time. Spices were popular. You know, like mint, cloves, rose, lilac, and of course, cinnamon. It is unknown when red cinnamon candies were first made, however, as sources tend to contradict others, and the term red cinnamon sugar appeared in Bernard Fentis's 1915 publication of Candy Medication. So the confection had to come long before 1908, when William Kolb's candy apples were first sold. So perhaps the reason he was reluctant to market candy apples was due to cinnamon's current reputation at the time, as being more of a treatment than also a treat. Or maybe he thought that that would be the assumption of his customers. After all, candy seemed to be as health motivated as sodas, the most successful grift of the 19th century that inspired Dipplin's move, Syrup Bomb, or the original name Mizuame Bomb, meaning water candy with the same last word. It's a 60 base power move that inflicts damage and lowers the target's speed stat by 1 stage each turn for the next 3 turns. For those who are unaware, Mizuame is a creation from glutinous rice mixed with malt. And candy overall in Japan dates back to the Edo period. Ha ha! Then we let the natural enzymatic process take place, converting the starch to syrup, which consists mainly of maltose. Now, what is Mizuame used for, other than making incredible works of art in amizaku? It's a sweetener traditionally used for wagashi, a traditional Japanese confection that is often served with green matcha tea.
How about that?
Gee, it's almost like Dipplin and Poltergeist were the perfect new mons for Kitakami. So, how do we wrap back to apples? Simple. Remember Mizuame, water candy? Ame means candy, and there's a certain treat shared at Japanese festivals, the Ringo Ame. Apple candy, the inspiration for Dipplin. Now we know what could have made the syrup for Dipplin itself, considering that Mizuame is a product of rice, and the original natural dye was made of either carmine or amaranth, which would still be used as food in Japan in their furikake and pasta dishes. We can deduce, drumroll please, Dipplin is a fully natural Pokemon. Unova would have a fit if they knew what that goo was made out of. But now we can be assured that its typing is completely justified, and that this unassuming Pokemon can be considered a work of art. To my delight, the story of Dipplin doesn't end as being merely a candy apple, while Flapple destroys the integrity of the apple to fly, and Appletun changes its apple through the power of its factory-like anatomy to become a symbiotic pie-in plant. Dipplin is different, as it maintains the majority of the fruit save for what the worm ate through and treats its syrup covering as a cocoon. Also adding a roommate. Yeah, 2 worms now inhabit the apple that Applin's debut games, Sword and Shield, would label a berry. Dipplin, being a duo, die means double, is known for being even more bulky than an Appletun. Is syrup more durable than dough? When it's hardened? Yes! But it has less special stats. Flapple is for attack, Dipplin is for defense, and Appletun is special. As in stats, not mental capacity, you dorks. Then Unova, my home region so far, introduced something that threw a wrench into my now favorite dragon type in the grass egg group's stat distinction. A brand new move
That was glitchy from release.
that increased the chances of critical hits by 1 stage to their ally in doubles. And yet this collaborative attack is the key to change a Mon with the same base stat total as the first in real life made Pokemon Rhydon into a Mon that shares a base stat total as a wealth of legendary, as in reputation, fully evolved Pokemon. Alternatively, this move increases the crit chance by 2 stages if their side partner is also a dragon type. Which means, surprise! It's time for yet another episode of
What did Lockstin forget?
Enter Hydrapple, bringing the best dang portmanteau to the lexicon of Pokemon. Serapents. Just brilliant! Even though it debuted in Viva Pinata first, but regardless, Applin is now a 3-stage Pokemon, thanks to red cinnamon syrupy apples, and a new attack too. But only Dipplin and Hydrapple of the Applin line can learn this new move. It's called Dragon Cheer or Dragon Yell in the original Japanese translation. It's like Nintendo of America's never heard of a battle cry. Well, at least these dragon types can learn it. Now, hold on. We had a worm.
It's Applin, but he doesn't have an apple.
Turn into the most visually accurate depiction of a Hydra yet in the Pokemon world. Sorry, Hydreigon. Of course, Hydrapple is made of 7 individual Serapents, inhabiting the gel-based syrup shell that once held an apple, that is now stabbed through one of its horns. And its special attack and defense outclass both Appletun and Dipplins. So what is distinct between a worm versus a Hydra? Now, I'm not exactly an expert on mythology. That's more Lockstin's turf. I'm only a mere budding botanist. But concerning the theme of apples, I must get to the core of their inspirations. With the limited amount of resources I have at the time of writing this, I will have to muster what I can to produce an answer. According to European legend, worms, or worms, yes, like the annelids, are serpentine dragons derived from the Norse word ormen, that are legless or have small legs. Worms of the old myth are found in various cultures and mythologies. Like the one from Germanic culture, possesses the ability to breathe fire.
Nope. Nope. Mm-mm. Nope. No!
Well, not these worms! And in some cultures are revered as symbols of strength and wisdom, or dangerous and unpredictable creatures. Small tangent, snakes are often affiliated with dragons, like the worm. They're etymologically similar too. In fact, the Latin word Draco is used for both dragons and snakes. Another aspect of the worm is the ability to exhale toxic fumes.
Are you kidding?
That barely works with Flapple. And to move with incredible speed.
It's called formal speedwalking.
Unlike the other dragon types that have redeeming qualities, worms are particularly destructive and malicious towards people.
Are you calling me dangerous?
They can be found specifically in swamps, marshes, and other dank or wet places. Or sometimes they can take up space in a lake or even a well. I'm beginning to feel they're not actually worms,
You think?
but actually a sub-category of the creature. The Weaver,
Seen in Final Fantasy XI.
though once found in France, is found in forests. Then there's the Weaver,
Also found in Final Fantasy XI.
a dragon easily deterred by the sight of naked flesh. I'm sure if it had a view of Lady Godiva, that would be quite comical. Then of course we will have to address the Hydra of Lerna, aka the grandchild of Gaia, offspring of serpentine giant Typhon and half-woman, half-snake Echidna. Very interesting. Back to the Hydra, which is the many-headed serpent, originally having 6 heads, that was slain by Hercules.
Honey, you mean Hercules?
Or Heracles, with its first illustrated depiction dating back to 700 BC, as the second of his 12 labors, with poisonous breath and blood so virulent that even its scent was deadly. What Lockstin neglected to add was that the whole regeneration factor was an added feature to the creature, then became part of the Marvel mythos, first appearing in Strange Tales 135 back in August of 1965. Funny how a simple change to myth completely changes the whole point. Cut off a limb and 2 more shall take its place. We serve none but the master. However, there are some issues with these types. The Weaver has wings, which Flapple could be, and could be derived from the Latin vipera, like Saviper. Then Weaver can be translated into wyvern. That's the Noibat line. And Noibat has a connection to Applin because of their apples being the target for their food. In the Pokemon mythos, they only eat fruit, being frugivores. Whereas the gymnophobe, the Weaver, spouts water, which still works with the Applin line with Hydrapple's Hydro Pump, had toxic breath, which only works for Flapple, and killed living things like plants and animals. The Hydra had 1 body, but many heads. Hydrapple have multiple bodies in one place, and its name, in Japanese, originally references the Orochi, which had 8 heads and 8 tails. Hydrapple only shows 5 heads and 2 tails. Perhaps the reason that we are having trouble finding its equal is because it's not actually a dragon at all. A dino. Dragon in name only. Think about it. This creature eats apples and bugs, but in myth, dragons don't like fruit, as they find it too sweet, but they will eat it if there isn't anything else on the menu. They tend to be carnivores, and really like bitter foods more. That means real dragons would adore the bitterness of Leppa berries, and would exclusively have a sassy nature with higher special defense and lowered speed. So what are they really? First of all, they're not snakes, as none are remotely herbivorous or omnivorous. They could be another reptile entirely, being either a skink, a Euromastix, a chuckwalla, and a rock iguana. Only one of them could be legless or have short legs, and that's the skink. Applin are lizards, specifically anguinae, that are native to Europe, Asia, North America, and North Africa. What's fun is that one species has a blue tongue and love munching on apples. In evolution, an Applin would gain longer legs depending on the form and look more lizard-like after adapting to its home, the modified Leppa berry. Then when it becomes a Hydrapple, being 7 legless skinks swimming in a syrup shell, it becomes an apple commune. Sadly, certain species of the animal are in danger due to invasive predators and sucks at defending itself.
I mean, look at this poor excuse of a moveset! One could say it's a glass lizard. But like Applin, they like to hang out in gardens, but are as affected as pests due to poisons. That further justifies the grass type and lack of poison type moves. Luckily, skinks are one of the most communal reptiles, but like the serpents, they work better when they are housed alone in the social sense. Or else there's a hierarchy with one being the dominant member. They aren't exactly aware of each other's boundaries, which also explains the lack of consistent power with their signature move, Fickle Beam. Not Pickle Beam. We're not talking about fermentation, Pimp Knight. Rule of thumb, it's not exactly wise to join adult skinks in one space. And in the way of the Hydrapple, it looks like always 2 of the serpent skinks are left out of most of the activities except for keeping the Pokemon in motion. 1 skink leads, 4 skinks work with a leader, then 2 are left with pushing their home forward. No one knows if the jobs alternate. That explains a lot. As the apple now stabbed with the branch horn, it maintains its color and vitality by continuing its counteracting the enzymes through a possibly byproduct of its
photosynthesis.
However, the purpose of the apple on Hydrapple, other than cosmetic reasons, is currently unknown. It's about time we look at the fruit itself. Next is the apple. It's a simple fruit, as peduncle what we expel. It is part of the stalk that has inflorescence that grows from a pedicel. The pedicel bridges between the fruit and the shoot. They have cell walls to give support. Helps mechanical, water, and nutrients they transport. The calyx of an apple comprises the sepals and blossoms too. The core contains the seeds and where the stem goes through. The apple actually has some pith, their parenchyma cells. Encircled by a ring of xylem where its starch pores dwell. It has a stamen too, you can guess what it can do. It's used for reproduction. We eat the plants of Pantheon. Calyx is the periantheum. Hope you enjoyed this brief introduction. So, let's see how the crabapple and its contemporary differ overall in nutritive abilities. Starting with pectin, the unripe crabapple has more pectin than its riper counterpart, but the latter fruit has more developed flavor. The pectin, its complex carbohydrate and polysaccharide, tends to be concentrated in the apple's skin and its core. Then, when it's cooked with sugar, it does a magic trick and becomes a gel. The gel is used as a thickener for cooking and baking, and is sometimes used to make medicine. Specifically, it becomes a binder to substances in your intestines, gives more bulk to your stool, could reduce how much your body absorbs of the bad cholesterol, prevents diabetes, treats heartburns, helps with diarrhea paired with kaopectate, don't listen to the FDA, and has been said to regulate blood sugars. While the Leppa berry would have the lion's share of pectin, it's the ripe apple that has more nutrients overall. As ironic as the name of the apple Malus domestica is, it has increased levels of folate, zinc, vitamin K, vitamin A, vitamin B2, vitamin B6, but less carbs, and is a better hydrator. But regrettably, some nutrients were lost in its growth, as the crabapple was the one with more copper, manganese, calcium, iron, now that's ironic, more magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, vitamin C, vitamin B1, more protein, yet more fats, and has more mono and polyunsaturated fats. On top of that, they feature lowered sugars, is lower on the glycemic index, has more minerals, and tends to be cheaper.
Well, I was wrong.
But even the fruit with the reputation of keeping the doctor away can't escape its namesake, because we have arrived at the next and most duplicitous member of the dirty dozen. Yeah, the apple is one of them. As when 90% were picked, they discovered traces of diphenylamine, a pesticide banned in Europe.
Of course, when the apple is the staple fruit there.
Unfortunately, there's the high possibility of an allergic reaction if you are sensitive to birch pollen. How funny. The tree with the name of the most cowardly professor has adverse effects to one of the best fruits. Also, too much apple fiber can lead to gastrointestinal issues. Side note, ironically, my Apple computer had issues turning on during the making of this video. The full video, I mean. It was a miracle I was able to upload this. I'm sure after this part, I'll be known as the Apple Guy. But I don't mind, as this fruit is iconic for very good reasons.
If you like what you see, press like, subscribe, and smash that bell to get notifications on the channel where everything grows on you.